thank you for those of you who are on time, and hopefully we'll get a few more stragglers coming out of that excellent panel discussion that's going on. But one of the things they talked about was getting down to action, and that's where I work, in the action. And today I want to talk about being more flexible about how we return water to our ecosystems. So when we were posed with the problem of, okay, we're going to take some water and we're going to return it to the environment, just how do we do that? The accepted research was saying what you do is you find out what's the natural water regime in a system, you identify the key elements, and then you attempt to mimic them as well as you can with the environmental water that you've got. So if we're talking about the Lower Murray, so below the Darling, we're talking about an ecosystem that's had a regime for the last 8,000 years. And we're talking about the trees in particular, the red gums and the black box, that are several hundred years old. So well and truly pre-river regulation. So they are still growing and expecting that natural regime. And it's been changing incredibly fast, particularly since the 1970s. And that's what Leslie Hughes was just talking about. We've got systems that are trying to catch up with this very rapid change. But our starting point for watering, therefore, was what happens in the river naturally. And for the Lower Murray, we're looking at our highest flows most likely to come through in mid-spring, mid to late spring. Every second or third year, we would expect at least some sort of flow, and a natural duration of more than 8 to 10 weeks. So all our ecosystems have evolved, adapted to that. That means our prime environmental watering season for this part of the world is October to December, if we're trying to mimic that natural regime. There's limits on that, limits on whether you can actually get the water delivered down the system to you at that time. And it's a real problem because everybody is trying to water at that time. And how do you get the water to the place you want it? Or if you're trying to lift it out of the river, as we have to do in low flows and regulated flows, then you need the equipment on the site, access to energy in some form, whether it's electricity or diesel. And so it's quite a difficult thing to do. And that's the constraints we've been working with. So just to look at the changes that we're dealing with, I got some data that ran over 120 years or so, and had a look at what was happening in the pre-regulated conditions. So I get the right button. Not sure, won't touch it in case I get the wrong one. So the pre-regulated conditions, there were actually no peak flows occurring in the first 6 months of the year, and the most of them were occurring in October and November, and quite a few in December. If you look at the graph below that, then you can see since 1976, when we've had the greatest diversion and the greatest amount of regulation in the river, we were getting peaks in the first months of the year, and look at the change in the number of high flows in October in particular, and also in November. The other graph there is showing you the mean monthly rainfall from Renmark, which just indicates that the highest chance of rainfall is in spring, and the highest natural chance of flows was in spring. So those two things normally would coincide. And what we're seeing now is they're not coinciding as much, and that the flow peaks are now tending to be later in hotter and drier conditions. So if we get germination on the floodplain, it then has to survive in the hottest period of the year. While we were trying to manage to our best ability, nature delivered a real get-out-of-jail-free card to us. The floods of 2010-2012 ended the millennium drought, and they were, in fact, not what we would call in the normal timings. They were late. The peaks were late in February of 2011, April 2012. The result was that the floodplain stayed wet for a much longer period. There was much higher soil moisture retention. 170 days continuously in the 2011 flows over the banks and onto the floodplain, and another 71 days in 2012. So that seems to be the elements of that flood that was really valuable. And then we had another flood in December 2016, which rose at a relatively slow rate, but then dropped away dramatically in a week. which is a function of how we manage the rivers. There was no further water coming down, so although the engineers were aware that they tried to slow that recession, they didn't have the water available. Please note that very long dry period in between the two floods, and that's where environmental watering came into its own. We were able to water the response to those first floods. We were able to add water to enhance the benefits. Another important point, something that Amy George drew to my attention, is it's not just the flows in the river that we need if we're looking at recruiting our major trees, the black box in particular. We also need rainfall at the same time. In 2011, we had that rainfall. So if you look at the rainfall graph there, I've circled the high points and the rainfall where they coincide with floods in the river. And it seems that the conditions in 2011-12 with the rainfall as well as the floods, that was a Goldilocks moment. Everything was just right. We're still trying to figure out what was just right about it, but the results are amazing. We have millions of baby black box, and they're at the middle level elevations of the floodplain where the highest water got to in 2011. The water in 2016 got to the same point, so they got some more water then. But in the gap in between, a lot of areas have been receiving environmental water. The reason being, we've just realised how valuable these seedlings are. There is no other substantial black box recruitment on the floodplain since 1956. If you go looking for germination that could have been triggered in the 1970s or the 1990s, there are little pockets, but there's nothing substantial. So these seedlings, they're now saplings, they're getting up, the watered ones are over 4 metres high. They are incredibly valuable, and we need to make sure that they get to maturity. Again, the science says that might be 20 years, although I have really good news. I have seen a black box sapling flowering at 6 years. So if they've got enough water, they will do really well. Just to demonstrate that our watering is making a difference, this graph is showing a comparison of non-watered mature trees with watered mature trees from May 2015. 2015 was quite dry. It was only 80% of mean rainfall at Loxton. 2016 was very wet, and in September they had 5 times the normal monthly average. So if you look at the blue bars as giving you the baseline, that's what the floodplain is doing just on its own. You see it goes up and down, or it does reflect drier periods. But at the end of the graph, it very definitely shows the advantage to the watered trees when we've come past that 2016 flood, and we've been quite dry since then. So the good news for people managing environmental water, from what we've been doing, I'm working with Water for Nature at Nature Foundation. They have a water allocation. We have now 90 sites on our books, mostly on private wetlands. Our results are showing that water at any time of the year is actually beneficial. Yes, we do want to try and promote that natural peak in late spring, early summer, but the other options mean that we can use water right through the water year because we're on accounting. We can link across multiple years to try and get the site results we need, having regard to what the natural cues are, but also being aware that there's lots of different purposes. And I'm just showing you an example there where, in order to deliver water to some very stressed black box, this lignum swamp got watered as well, because it's not that easy to get the water to your targets. So we got a double bonus. The mature black box started to recover, but the lignum also, you look at the greenness, just add water. It's magic. There's the mature trees in the next photo. Those are the ones that were our targets. And we had new ground cover and new leaves on the trees within 3 to 4 weeks. But the important point here is we've got an ecosystem that is still recovering from the reduced flow since the 1970s and from the millennium drought. It hasn't recovered its resilience. It's not ready for the next drought. So what we're able to do is to try to increase the health and resilience of those trees. Lots of different ways to do it, and it means that we can water at almost any time of the year. So there's multiple opportunities to connect up flows through the floodplain creeks, to piggyback on weir-pool manipulations, to top up pools. And the last point I really want to make is priming, we have discovered, in late autumn, winter, means that you get a much better result when you water again the following spring. So, as I said, we're trying to maintain health. We're trying to maintain soil moisture reserves in the unsaturated zone and reduce stress in the mature trees along the way. So here's the example of priming. This is Riversley Lagoon, just downstream of Lock 2. And putting that water in late autumn meant that when we filled the following year, we weren't starting from scratch, we weren't starting from a dry wetland bed, and we got an enormous response both in the aquatic plants that grew, the riparian plants that grew, the water birds that came to visit, and even the small native fish that turned up. So by using water throughout the year, by moving away from our original stance of trying to just mimic the natural regime, by mimicking rather the change regime, we think we have a much better chance of delivering the outcomes that are in the watering plan. For 2018-19, we're looking at a dry period, so it's going to be water just in the main channel. It's not going to be any overbank flows. So we're going to have to look for the sites where we can water to relieve stressed mature trees, create drought refuges, continue to sustain those 2011 black box. I look for trees with nesting hollows. But watering throughout the year is going to help us deliver to meet those targets. Thank you.